introduction. I can hardly wait to hear what I'm going to say. Can't hear me?
Tilt your microphone up just a smidge.
You missed a funny joke. Sorry. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. Emily, my mother would be. Could you turn that down, please? You would make my mother very happy because you read that exactly as she wrote it. I took a public speaking course once, and they said that you can make or lose your audience in the first couple minutes. And a case in point, I don't know if you've ever heard of Alfred E. Smith. He ran for president. Some people are nodding. Maybe it's current events for you. At any rate, Alfred E. Smith was governor of New York, and as part of his job, he would go around and visit the various cities and institutions. So one day he's visiting Ossing, New York. Does anyone know what institution's in Ossing, New York? Good. Sing Sing prison.
Oh.
Okay, so he goes to the prison, and the warden takes him around, and at the end, the warden says, Governor, would you mind talking to the inmates? And Al, a very outgoing Irishman, said, no, get them together. So you get them all in the mess hall, and Al walks up and he said, Gentlemen, I'm so glad to have you here. I want to get a little bit more serious right now. Every time I come to this building, I am so impressed. It is a real gem. And as a resident of Washington County, I'm so thankful for it. And I want to commend Brent Peterson, the executive director back there, for all the work they did getting this together. Does anyone know how many counties there are in Minnesota? 87. 87, right. And you know how many get historical societies get support from their county government? 86. Guess which one doesn't? Washington County. So Brent and the gang did it all on their own, the board. So again, thank you for that. It is so wonderful. Okay, also, I'm going to be, there's some text on here, so I will, for those who are reading handicapped or challenged, I am going to read the script or paraphrase it so that you get the meaning of it. Now, if we can get this thing going, Emily, let's see, first slide. Oh, presented by, guess who? Bill Schrankler. And Emily said I'm on the board of the Woodbury Heritage Society. Okay, orphan trains, what are they? Well, it's more than just a train with orphans on it. It's a social movement. That's one of the most famous, well, read this. The orphan trains are among the most famous episodes in adoption history. Between 1855 and 1929, over 250,000 children, 500,000, were moved from eastern cities, were sent by trains to towns in Midwestern and Western states, as well as Canada and Mexico. So 250 kids, that's 13 times the population of Stillwater. So for every person in Stillwater, 13 more kids would have come. So it was a big movement during that time, and it started before the Civil War. And it's become a icon of for the media industry. There have been several movies made of them. I won't read. I'll just this one's called The Orphan Train. It was Jill Eckenberry and Glenn Close, released in '79. Another one was West by Orphan Train. That was more recent than 2014. And then PBS has one on the American Experience. It was released in 2006. So, but there's many more, many more. And there have been, I won't say countless books, but there have been a great number of books. These are just some of the more popular ones. Orphan Trains by Marilyn Ivan. That's an old one, a 44, but I still use it as reference once in a while. This is just 12 years old. It's called Roots. This is tracing, I guess mostly men, but it could be women who rode the Orphan train and served in World War II. And this is a Orphan train disaster. These are all non-fiction, but there are many fiction books that have been written too. Okay, what is an orphan? Well, if I asked most of you, this is what you would say, and I would say most of the time. It's a child who has lost both parents through death. Okay? Okay. But for purposes of the movement and for my presentation, it's a broader definition is used. This orphan for this presentation is defined as an orphan does not have any surviving parent to care for them 14 years of age or younger. So that includes homeless kids mainly, and that sweeps them up, who wouldn't be with the other definition. Okay, this is the book that she referred to, Shadows of Time. And I put that depot on the cover of the book, because without that depot, I wouldn't be here. How can that be? Well, this little girl came in 1911 to Medelia, Minnesota on the Orphan train. She later turned out to be my mother.
Oh, wow.
There she grew up, and in Medelia, she became a nurse in St. Joseph's Hospital in St. Paul. And one of her early patients was my dad. That's how they met. And Anne Schrankler, my mother, lived to be 101 years old. She was the last surviving screenwriter in Minnesota. Not the last, but one of the last. And she was very proud of that. And she's mentioned in some of the books that I talked about before. Now, the interesting thing, the people that adopted her in Medelia, Minnesota, were Mary and Wendell Lamb. And Wendell was a butcher in Medelia. I have good memories of him. And Mary, my grandmother, came on the Orphan train also. And so I have both a mother and a grandmother who came on the Orphan train. And that's why I have such an interest in it. My grandmother was never adopted. She actually ended up in the Canadian border. And when I remember her, she had a French accent, so I assumed she lived in the French-speaking part of Canada. And she also knew a lot about Indians, too. She would, plant things by the moon and all that kind of stuff. So she's an interesting gal. I took my mother down to the History Theater once. They had a play on the Orphan train, and all the people who rode the Orphan train got to wear this ribbon, and she was so proud of that. Okay, why is this problem? Why were there so many homeless children or orphans? Well, we had a lot of empty space in America in the early 1800s. So after 1853, the U.S. Railroad sent announcements to Europe and the rest of the world inviting people to come to America. This is an example of it. This is that's just in Topeka and Santa Fe, trying to get people to come. But you know who was the big promoter of that? It was James J. Hill, who was the Great Northern. He had agents, particularly in Northern Europe and Scandinavian countries. And they would arrange boat transportation, and when they got to New York, he tried to get them to come further west. So we start getting a lot of people on the East Coast, particularly New York, Boston, and Philadelphia. And overcrowding became a real problem. And when you get that many people, you get some class differences. So the conditions in the cities were appalling. There was a wide gulf between the rich and poor. Doesn't sound so different than now. The new factory owners were very rich and they had mansions on Broadway. Well, the other people, working families, had small rooms or apartments and really squalid conditions. Thousands of children were orphaned by disease. It was a very poor health system in that period. And many mothers died from childbirth, unfortunately. One survey found more than 10,000 homeless children. This was in the late 1800s. But just recently they did a survey and there's over 9,000 homeless children in New York even now. But the population is, doubled or tripled since then, so it's not really the same proportion. And here's some of the conditions that they lived under. These photographs were taken by Andrew Rees, or Jacob Rees, and we'll talk about him a little later. And this one is interesting. It's called Moving Day. On the first of each month, because many of these people couldn't pay rent, they were forced to move. So there's always a big change over the first of the month of people moving, and somebody captured it on canvas. So you can see that there's some, the overcrowding was causing some conditions. Port cities became overcrowded with assorted jobs filled by cheap labor. Many continued westward, but many countless others stayed on in the big cities. Okay, we got a problem, now we need a solution, okay? So, the first solution was the Children's Aid Society. It was founded in 1853 by Charles Loring Brace, who was a clergyman. And this mission, Children's Aid mission, had the specific aim of educating, housing, finding permanent homes for orphan and abandoned and impoverished children. And they intended to do that by operating industrial schools, teaching skills, by Sunday schools, teaching religion, by teaching farming at farm schools, and reading rooms, making the children literate, and I'm not sure what lodging houses are. I'm not just been like dormitories. I've not been able to find more about that. Okay, how did Brace intend to solve this problem with the orphan train system? Well, he loaded 46 kids on a train in 1854, and they went off to Michigan, a town I never heard of, to find homes. And when they got there, they would, the children would go up on the station platform. Townspeople would come in and they would pick out which child they wanted. There was no vetting these people were going to be good parents. They were just pulled out. And many of them were looking for labor. And the Children's Aid Society also relocated whole families at a time too, and put them on the orphan train. That was a minor part of the program. And these families traveled with the groups. And this program went on until 1929 when it was ended. The Children's Aid Society still exists, if we're going to chat about that, but no longer are the orphan trains in operation. By the way, I said triumph or tragedy, and there's, right now we got, I think, some trials going on in the United States. You might have heard about them. And so I want you to be a jury, okay? And at the end we'll see if you think the program was a triumph or a tragedy. Okay, so kind of keep that in mind, be open-minded about it. The Children's Aid Society, now known simply as Children's Aid, continues to serve children, youth, and families in New York City. They placed over 120,000 people during their history. So they were one of the biggest operations of the trains. Excuse me, America. Other institutions followed the Children's Aid Society. Among them, you probably heard of this one, New York Foundling Hospital. That's where both my mother and grandmother came from. That operated up to 1946. And then there was two of them in Boston that were pretty active. One was the Baldwin Place Mission, and I love the name of this one. Home for the Little Wanderer. Kind of sweet, isn't it? And that went up to 1993. These are the Boston ones. There's some photos of them. This is the Baldwin Place Mission, which is really a church. Okay, the second solution was the New York Foundling Hospital. And all that is really a result of this wonderful woman, founded in 1869 by the Sisters of St. Vincent de Paul. The driving force was Sister Irene Fitzgibbon. She got the idea, but she didn't know what to do with it. But the good Archbishop sanctioned the project, and in 1869, she was assigned to put it into effect. The first hospital, I guess you'd call it, opened up at Brownstone on East 12th Street in New York. She rented it on October 11th, 1869. The system opened up with a cradle at the door. And that was the typical way mothers would leave the babies on the front doorstep at night and then take off. My mother, what we can find out, was brought by her mother to the foundling, and that would be my real grandmother, I guess. She came for 2 years and nursed my mother at the foundling hospital before my mother went out for adoption. Something must have really been hard for her to see my mother leave like that. And it still exists. Thought I had a picture of what it looked like in 1870. Well, it was, oh, there it is. Okay. That typical brownstone, and but now it has that modern building on the right and doesn't need as much space as it had then. There it is again, the comparison. This is the building I just showed you was the administration. This is the actual hospital. And there was another one just for a children's hospital, because apparently scarlet fever was a big problem with children. And this one still exists in New York. Okay, compare the two, the New York Foundling Hospital and the Children's Aid Society. How are they different? Well, the Children's Aid Society, they took children with just agents to the town and they'd show up. They let the people know they were coming, but they would just go anywhere there was a good railroad station. Unloaded children and allowed the townsmen and women to choose a child, pick a kid. And there was nothing done in advance. Let me read it. Proceedings were not done in advance, besides sending out posters announcing the arrival of the children in several weeks prior. And the children who were not chosen were put back on the train, moved on to the next town. And I don't know if they just kept going until there weren't any kids left, but there is some papers done on what happened to the unwanted children. In the New York Foundling, the nuns did it a little bit differently. They worked through the churches in the Midwest. And their motivation was they were worried that Catholic kids were being put in Protestant homes. So, they were going to do something about it, so they did work through the churches. And they did advanced placements before the trip. They would vet the parents who wanted them, make sure they were able to do it and had the resource to do so.
Yeah.
So that way each child had a family waiting for them at the train station when they came. And my grandma tells about going to the depot and waiting for my mother to come on the train. She came with a nun from New York, and so all that's true. These are just some of the documents that went out with them. The one on the left is the only receipt that was given to the hospital for a child. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about where they were checked on. Okay, now you know what the two are like. Okay, I got a test for you. I was a teacher.
Good.
Okay. This is a Norman Rockwell painting. With the clues I've given you, is this from the New York Foundling or the Children's Aid Society? How many think it's from the New York Foundling? Or from the Children's Aid? They're both right. Okay. The nun is the way it could be from the Foundling, but the fact that there were so many kids in one train, it's probably give the idea that the Children's Aid Society, which Norman Rockwell was appealing to all audiences. Everyone had a correct answer based on the previous slide. It could be either one, the New York Children's Aid Society or the New York Foundling Hospital. Now, this the Norman Rockwell painting was illustrated in the 1951 story of Good Housekeeping called Good Boy by Mary McSherry. The image does not do justice. It's a 32 by 68 painting. In the story, the narrative of the story is that an old man remembers at age 5 being the youngest child on a foundling train that ferries the survivors of an orphanage, survived the fire of an orphanage fire. Their attendant nuns took them to cities out in the west to seek home and so forth. Anyway, that was the issue it was in. But the interesting thing is a movie was made of it with Greer Garson and Walter Pidgeot. Unfortunately, I can remember them, maybe some of you can too. And they set it in Canada, and it just didn't ring true to the story in the book. So the critics say, I never saw it. Now, this is an interesting guy. He is Jacob Reese. Let me tell you a little bit about Jacob. He's quite a remarkable guy, and he figures into all of this scenario of the orphan trains. He's from Denmark, born in 1849, and he died in 1914 in Massachusetts. Or is that Maine, Massachusetts? Okay, he was a social reformer, a social documentary photographer, and a muck-raking journalist. He made his money when he came to the United States as a muck-raking journalist. In case you don't know that ever existed, they were people who were hired to find dirt on political opponents. It occasionally happens today. That's how it made a living. But he really was a pretty decent guy. And he wrote a book, what do you call it? How the Other Half Lives, which was a kind of a bestseller and an eye-opener. And he partnered up with somebody else. Can you guess who that icon might represent? Teddy Roosevelt, yes, in New York City. Well, here, I got a little film clip that'll maybe help you understand.
Did you need sound for this, Bill?
Do you hear that? Turn the sound up, will you, please?
When Theodore Roosevelt becomes the police commissioner, he makes big changes. He forces the police chief to resign from office.
And once he had changed the top leadership, then he knew he had to change the entire culture because it really was the way of life in the police department. And that meant understanding the policeman on the beat at night in New York. So what he decides is that he's got to have his own first-hand information.
He immediately contacts his friend, Jacob Reese, who has become nationally famous in recent years for writing an expose of the ills of urban life and tenement life called How the Other Half Lives. And Roosevelt knows that Reese got a lot of his material by prowling the city after midnight.
Jacob Reese knew the back streets and tenements of New York City better than anybody else. And he matched that with a new technology of flash photography. So he could go into the darkest of the stale deer dives. He could go into the underground flop houses. He could go into the basement tenements and catch a literal snapshot of how the other half lives.
So he does these famous midnight rambles where he and Reese go out between midnight and 5 a.m. He'll put a floppy hat on his head, a long coat on. He'll walk unbeknownst among the people so that he can see what's actually happening on the street.
And they find policemen that are sleeping at their posts. They find policemen that are drinking in bars and carousing with prostitutes and are just outraged, and he decides to do something about it.
Officer Brody? Yeah? Should we be at your post? Take a hike. Beat it. Be careful. Who's this? Henry is. Ought to knock some sense in him.
Wait. It's Roosevelt.
It's not.
It is, I swear. I see it in the paper.
It's all right.
Now, Mr. Roosevelt, I already stopped here.
Thank you both for a most illuminating evening. I shall see you in my office tomorrow.
Policemen are fired, people are reassigned, and there's immediately a sense that Roosevelt is cleaning up the town, like that kind of Western sheriff that he so admired.
Quite a guy. Now, he got so interested in the plight of the children, dealing with Reese, that he became a board member of the Children's Aid Society, and the rest of the Roosevelt, some of the other Roosevelt family also joined, and they actually got that Children's Aid Society functioning very well. So he was quite a guy. Now I got a quiz for you. If you can identify who played Theodore Roosevelt, you get a window seat on a Boeing 738. Do you know who that was?
Richard Dreyfuss.
It was Leonardo DiCaprio.
Was it? No.
Yeah, boy, I didn't make it up. And you probably recognize the voice of that woman as Doris Corns Goodwin in Historian. We just had the new book came out. Yes, ma'am.
Can you use the microphone? It's hard to hear you back here.
I'm sorry. It was Leonardo DiCaprio. Did you catch that?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, thanks for telling me. This just came out last year. It's a 5-hour documentary on Amazon Prime by Scorsese. Was the director, so it's all high caliber stuff. So you might want to see it.
What was the name of it?
Very clever, Roosevelt. And yeah, he was quite a guy, as you well know. Besides this kind of stuff, just a little highlights of his life. Tells you what's so important in the orphan training movement. Yeah, you guessed it. Who else would Teddy Roosevelt? He was born in 1858 and died in 1919. Deep friendship between Jacob Riis and Roosevelt began in 1895 when then Police Commissioner Roosevelt sought out Riis to become a police reporter. Riis took the commissioner on a series of nighttime forays into the slums and used the relationship to make reforms for the police and health departments. Roosevelt became aware of the plight of homeless children and became an avid supporter for their care. Roosevelt was a prime supporter of the Children's Aid Society, and he also was intimately familiar with politics and child saving. So we owe a lot to him in that respect too. Some highlights of yes. He was a politician, statesman, soldier, conservationist, naturalist, historian, and writer who served as the 26th President of the United States. He has so many achievements, we have so few balloons, and he's also on Mount Rushmore. Now, he was the police commissioner. Do any of you watch Blue Bloods? Okay. Have you ever noticed his pictures on the wall? Yes. He serves as a model for, what's this, Frank Reagan, is that his name? There he is. And just, this was well enough, in January, they this is taken from a January episode. And they were having trouble with the police department, the morale, and then Frank didn't know what to do, and the advisors. Finally, one of the advisors said, WWTRD. What does that mean? Oh, okay. What would Teddy Roosevelt do? Substitute Jesus or Roosevelt. And this is an album of Reese's photographs that led to Roosevelt's conversion. And I'm just going to kind of quickly go through the photos, but you can see how they would move you with what they saw. Okay, where the orphan went, you know, this is supposed to be about Minnesota, so let's talk about Minnesota. We have over 3,000 of the orphans who sent here, 3,258 orphans into Minnesota from New York. And they went all over the United States. The black states were the heaviest, Illinois, Iowa, and Missouri. But the red states, like us, got between 3,000 and 5,000 children in the orphan trains. And even Alaska got them. And it looks like Hawaii got 3. Ultimately, the implementation of the child labor laws, along with the rise of the welfare system in the 1930s, led to the end of the orphan training complex. But its legacy is still felt throughout the country. In Minnesota, prior to 1870, we had 5 kids come. Between 80 and 83, another 340 came. Now, these 340 caused some problems through reports of abuse of those children. Just to show you the scale of the amount of them that came in that 3-year period. Okay, some of the reports were such as this. In Whatman County, that's down where Medina, where my mother came from, a farmer turned a boy out in winter because he was useless. They would often, not often, but once in a while abandon a boy, particularly on a farm, because they couldn't use him in the winter time. And even as disturbing as down in Rock County in the corner of the state, a little girl living on a filthy dirt floor. Well, these reports started surfacing, and it was causing some concerns among the population. So in 1883, at the Capitol at that time, the House of Representatives passed a bill that created, the legislature established a state board of corrections and charities that would govern such things as orphans placements. At that time, the governor was Lucas Hubbard, and I think there's a county named after him in Minnesota. But he had to find someone to be the commissioner of this new entity. So he went to a church down in Worthington, Minnesota, and snatched a well-known minister, Hastings H. Hart, who, just from reading on, the guy must have walked on water. I mean, he would do no wrong, and it was a very good choice. Because he wanted someone who had integrity to examine these 340 cases where there was some suspected abuse. So this was Hart. Here's the background. He went to Overland County College. He did not apply for this position. Hubbard went after him. He was really sought and highly thought of by his peers. And he did such a good job in Minnesota that he was commissioned by the National Board to investigate these reports in Minnesota, which he did, and did a fine job. They chose him because his findings not likely to be disputed, because Hart had no connection with the Children's Day Society. He had no invested interest. Okay, here are the 4 questions they asked him to answer. Were children sent out who were were vicious and depraved. Some of the adoptive parents would say, we got these rotten kids, you know, we can't control them. Was this really true? His findings were a few such cases, but no evidence that their selection was intentional. Bad kids weren't being sent out by the nuns or the Children's Aid Society. Okay, second question, were children placed without proper investigation of the families into which they were placed? Were any ill-used? Only 5 or 6 cases out of 340 did he find any evidence of that. Were children tracked after placement to see that they were continued to be well treated? The children were revisited by the agents of the society, although visits were often brief and cursory. Now my mother tells me she remembers a man coming about once a year from the Foundling Hospital. Always gave her a nickel, I think she said.
Yeah.
But he was there to check to see if she was being well treated. How well did the children turn out as adults? Findings, only 32 of the 134 over age 13 turned out badly. And I don't know how you'd find that. This is an interesting sidelight, factoid if you're ever on Jeopardy. Riding an orphan train west in 1859, a tough street kid named John Brady formed a friendship with a fellow orphan, Andrew Burke. One would grow up to be governor of Alaska, the other the governor of North Dakota. Brady lived from 47 to 1918. He was an American politician and served as governor of Alaska from 1897 to 1906. And this guy's even a little more amazing. John Burke lived from 1859 to 1937. He was a lawyer, a jurist, a political leader from North Dakota, and served as governor of North Dakota from 1907 to 1913. Then he went on to Washington. He was in a cabinet position in Washington after that. So a lot of these orphans turned out fairly well, including my mother.
She had a great job.
Now, this is a newspaper advertising for the children coming, the train coming, and you want children. Down in the lower left-hand corner in that red circle, you probably can't read it. It talks about this guy. You still can't read it.
Mark.
Okay. His name is Clark, Herman Clark. And he was from New York. I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. He became interested in the Children's Aid Society and for somehow came out to Dodge Center, Minnesota. I don't know how you'd end up in Dodge Center, but. And he became an agent for the Children's Aid Society, but not only for that area. He traveled thousands of miles each year finding good homes for these kids. So he really was a wonderful guy and did a good job. I think he's buried in Dodge Center. I'm not going to read this whole thing, but he received a lot of letters after he retired from kids he had placed that were so moved by what he did for them that he combined them and put them in a book. It's called Orphan Trains and Their Precious Cargoes. Again, an offspring of the movement. Okay, how about Minnesota? Well, when we had these 340 kids that were concerned about being abused, Hubbard and the others said, we need our own society here. We can't rely on the Children's Aid Society in New York. So they established the Children's Home Society in Minnesota. It was established by another clergyman, E.B. Savage, in St. Paul. It still exists, so you'll see that too. And again, his goal was to find homes for these people, the children as they arrived in the Midwest, on orphan trains and so forth. The Reverend focused on finding each child a family, and 1 year traveled nearly 25,000 miles by horse and wagon, local trains, and streetcars, carrying out this mission. The mission of the Children's Home Society is to help children thrive and to build, strengthen, and sustain individual, family, and community life. On July 1st, 2012, the Children's Home Society combined with the Lutheran Social Services Organization to combine their efforts and secure loving families for the kids. Okay, now, we've got to start thinking, was the orphan train movement a triumph or tragedy? Okay, well, it's both. The orphan train movement between 1854 and 1929 was both. How can that be? Well, the movement relocated abandoned, unwanted children to give them a brighter and happier future. That moved around 300,000 lost children out of the major cities and was headed them towards the Midwest. Some children were given a promised life, what they were promised, including my mother. Countless other children suffered many wrongdoings, such as abuse, rape, and in some cases murder. One orphan train rider, Emily Kidder, says, she wrote a book, the process is not unlike picking out a puppy. One way to describe it. This is a very interesting story. It's the Great Orphan Abduction in Arizona. In 1904, that's before Arizona was a state, there was a priest from France in a town called Clinton in Arizona. And he thought it'd be nice if the Mexican women could have children in his parish. So he made an arrangement with, I think it was New York Family, yeah, it must have been, he was Catholic. So nuns came out with 40 kids, Anglo kids, white kids, and they were placed in these Mexican homes. Well, the other Anglo mothers in the city were not happy about seeing those kids in those homes because they're going to be abused. You just know those migrants, that's what they do. And so they formed, these mothers, hardly women doing this, formed vigilantes and they stormed the houses, they took the kids, abducted them, really kidnapped them, and brought them to their homes. Well, of course, the Mexican mothers were upset and went to the Supreme Court. And guess who the Supreme Court held up for their support? The white mob. I mean, it just shows you the depth of racial prejudice. We still have it here, but I mean, how terrible is it then? Just to rip kids out of homes because of the race and the races of the parents. This is some of the articles that came out about they were Irish kids, by the way. All of them were Irish kids, fair-skinned Irish kids. Maybe that even made it harder, I don't know. Because they had, the result of the potato famine, had a lot of them in New York. Okay, the last surviving orphan train rider in Minnesota passed away, what was it, 8 years ago now. And she related to you, almost like your name. She arrived in 1917 on Milwaukee Railroad Depot in downtown Minneapolis. By the way, are any of you from Minneapolis? A couple? Okay. Or maybe a lot of you know people from Minneapolis? Okay, you know someone from Minneapolis. Okay, you know, there's a big rivalry between Minneapolis and St. Paul. I've lived with that all the way. But those of you from Minneapolis, or in favor of Minneapolis, let me point out, Minneapolis is not mentioned in the Bible, not even once. I use that story to go around lectures on my book, and I would do that story. And one day, a woman said, "Bill, you know what Minnehaha means?" And I said, "No." She said, "Well, Minnie means Minneapolis, and haha means St. Paul." So she got a. She died in 68. She was 101 years old. Okay, we still remember the whole movement, although I think there's only 4 or 5 riders still left alive. But down in Kansas, Concordia, Kansas, there's a National Orphan Train Complex. It's a museum, a national museum. And even in Minnesota, we have an organization called the New York Orphan Train Riders of Minnesota. It's also known as the Orphan Riders of New York. And it was founded by a Franciscan sister up in Little Falls, Minnesota, who rode the orphan train. And she's passed away, but they meet each fall, and my mother used to go up there. And last fall, I went up there. I hadn't been there before. It's right on the campus of the Franciscan sister. So they're still alive, the thought about it and remembering them. Okay, time to talk. Someone said they met someone who rode on the orphan train. Who was that? Could you tell us about that?
Well, there was a gentleman living here in Stillwater, and I'm sure he's not living anymore, but his wife worked at the bank downtown where I used to go, and he told me about it, that he was one of them that came from New York or wherever.
Interesting.
But I can't remember the names. I don't know if anybody else would remember it, but.
Are any of you related to any of the orphan riders?
My great-great-grandmother, who came from Iceland, she lived in North Dakota.
Uh-huh.
And an orphan train young girl lived with her for maybe 10 or 20 years before she died.
Okay, there's a connection there. Okay,
Yeah.
interesting. Well, great. Well, yes, sir.
I'm not a product of the train itself, but I am a product of the progress that has been made over the years. I was born in 1936, and my birth certificate, it says in there that I was an illegitimate child. So I want you all to know. A question for the group: is there anybody else who has a birth certificate that there's a box that legitimate and illegitimate? Does anybody else have it?
My grandfather has one that says father unknown, so it's the same thing.
What happened to me was I ended up progressing from being with my birth mother for a short time, then going to places called boarding houses. I spent time in, according to the information that I have, I spent 2 periods of time in these boarding houses, and then I ended up in an adoption agency in Brooklyn, New York. I was born in Baltimore, Brooklyn, New York, and then the Menacheims. My name now is Menachem. I started off with Richard Henry Pedoni. Nobody knows where that came from. And then I became Doug Menachem in 1938. But my parents, the Menacheims, God bless them, they never told anybody that they were going to adopt a child. And so they had conversations going on with the adoption agency, and they drove down from eastern Pennsylvania to New York City and had conversations with the people, and they gave my mother as much history as they could, and they decided to take me home. And so I went home with them, and they came back, and they had this adoption child, And the rest of the story is a history, and it's
Oh,
just a,
wonderful story.
it was a
Thank
good
you for
start.
sharing.
I'm getting ready to write my memoirs. Emily's gonna tell me how to write the show.
Yeah, to write the whole thing.
So I'm looking forward
Yes,
to
ma'am.
I have a question. Were there records kept of these children, their names and the dates they rode the train? Anything?
Yes, the New York Foundling, I think both of them have them. Because my mother went back to the New York Foundling and found the records. That's where she found out that her mother brought her and nursed her for 2 years. So, but they were sealed for a long time. When I was, this is kind of funny, when I was doing our family history, I wanted to get to my mother's records, so I contacted New York Foundling Hospital. They said, well, you have to have your mother's permission. Well, she'd been dead about 5 years or something. But the New York laws changed so they could release them. Yes, yeah. Sir?
These programs cost a lot of money. How were they funded?
Public, donations. They didn't get government money. I mean, till
Private
now,
money,
but, yeah. That's why the Roosevelts were very important in fundraising. Good question. Ma'am?
How common was it that the children from the same family were separated?
Quite often, yes,
Very often.
yes. Because they would, when they put them on the platform, a farmer might want a boy and a woman in town might want a girl for working, so. But the Kansas City museum does an effort to unite that, the descendants of the families now, right? Yes, ma'am.
Speaking of this man's birth certificate saying illegitimate, we have our fourth child is adopted from Korea.
Oh,
And on her birth certificate, it says legitimate and it has our names as mother and father. So they have made some progress.
but I bet you were vetted quite a bit, weren't you, before you?
Oh, yeah.
Yes, yes. Do any of the others have adopted children? Were you vetted quite a bit too before?
Yes.
Yeah,
In
they're very
Ca-
strict
in
about that.
California.
All thanks to Hubbard's law. Right. Well, thank you, folks. Have a safe trip home, and I enjoyed seeing you and meeting you and seeing an old friend I see every Tuesday morning in a men's group.